scholar for 25 years, was an art teacher at the Readymade College in Leeds, and for 4 years also taught at the University of Leeds until 2009. In his PhD thesis on writing Duchamp, Mode et Parole à tous les étages, from 2008, Thompson presented a recontextualization of Duchamp's early work. And recently, Thompson has co-curated several exhibitions on Duchamp, among them A Lady's Not a Gent's and Elsa in Philadelphia at Summer Hall in Edinburgh. In these exhibitions, as well in his book from 2015, Duchamp's Urinal, The Facts Behind the Facade, he present an ardent critique of the attribution of fountain to Duchamp, arguing in detail that Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhofen should be recognized as the real inventor of the work. Today, Glyn Thompson is going to apply his knowledge on Duchamp's Readymade in a lecture with the intriguing title Duchamp's Actual Readymade, in which he promises to demonstrate that the art world's embrace of the ready-made is fundamentally at odds with Duchamp's own understanding. Thus, having with us a scholar who's deeply invested in dismantling what he calls the Marcel Duchamp mythology industry, I'm sure that we can look forward to an engaged and well-prepared lecture, so please help me welcome Glyn Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. I'm still trying to work out how I slipped under the radar. Okay, here we go. A note about the illustrations. They're sometimes specific, such as Rocher's photographs of Duchamp's live-in studio at the Atelier building in 1918, or the Masonic tracing board that you'll see later in a popular print. But they're mostly general, such as the images of French quincailleries from around 1900 and American hardware stores from around 1915. The first and last are advertisements published in the Philadelphia Public Evening Ledger. The last on March the 20th, 1917, but the first, the very day that the Independence opened, and the day in which Blind Man 1 was published, in 1910, April the 10th. These serve as a warning that all is not what it might first appear to be in Duchamp world. And you should, I won't talk much about the illustrations because you all know them. In his introduction to the symposium titled The Ready-Made Century, held at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin in October 2017, Lars Blank reaffirmed a venerable misunderstanding of his assumption of a seamless imbrication of Duchamp's originating ready-made objects made in the 1910s with a discursive field of derivatives, also conforming, according to Helen Molesworth, to the same definition. According to Blank, one of the best definitions, if the ready-made is to be defined at all, can be found in Helen Molesworth, who considers the ready-made to be a discursive field or a discursive formation, brackets Foucault. For Molesworth, this field contains the ready-made objects Duchamp made in the 1910s, the replicas that were produced in the 50s and 60s, Duchamp's notes, interviews and lectures, Duchamp as a self-agent, and last but not least, the extraordinary reception of the ready-mades by art historians, end of quote, old Uncle Tom Cobley and all, it would seem, or to put it another way, Alt und Tagen Kirchenwasken, a kitchen sink being like a urinal, a sanitary fixture. That in Danish is include everything and the kitchen sink. Failing, unlike Duchamp himself in 1916, to distinguish substantively between a ready-made object, genre object, a ready-made work of art, genre art, species ready-made, and a ready-made, genre ready-made, Blank's misconception of the latter was grounded in a persistent systemic failure of the Duchamp establishment to exercise due diligence in ascertaining the actual provenance of Duchamp's own definition of the ready-made, and therefore its true identity. The definition falsely attributed to Duchamp, that entered the master narrative of avant-garde art in 1935, diametrically opposed to Duchamp's original authentic conception of 1916, debuted by André Breton in the text Phare de la Mariée, published in Minotaur 6, also appearing in Position Politique Surrealism in the same year, read as follows, in translation, manufactured objects promoted to the dignity of the art object by the choice of the artist. An embryonic version of this definition had been published by Breton in 1924 in a magazine article entitled Marcel Duchamp that was reprinted in Les Pas Perdus, Passing unremarked in the art world is the absence from that date from art exhibitions of manufactured objects purporting to be art and signed by artists in homage to Duchamp's exemplar confirms. As the references to Cubism, Futurism and Dada in the final sentence of the previous paragraph affirm, Breton was speaking of Duchamp's concept in the context of art. But is not the personality of choice, the independence of which Duchamp, for example, by signing a manufactured object, was one of the first to proclaim, the most tyrannical of all? This reflection on independence from the tyranny of personal choice seems to mark the first appearance in the public domain of any reference to Duchamp's signing of manufactured objects. Unremarked by Breton, it cites the only characteristic shared by the ready-made work of art and the ready-made, that both were already made. 3 years later, Breton, substituting the adjective usuel for the earlier manufacturé, broadened the definition of 1935. It is now no longer a single manufactured object, but now any ordinary, commonplace and everyday item, in order to subsume all of Duchamp's three-dimensional works, a total of 35 is mentioned in Phare de la Mariée, into the burgeoning typology of the surrealist object. The modified definition of 38, citing no reason for the change, appeared in Breton and Paul Eluard's Dictionnaire abrégé de surréalisme, 1938. Ready-made. Everyday, ordinary, commonplace object promoted to the dignity of the art object by the mere choice of the artist. Oh, where are we? That's the wrong one. Oh, that's right. So we're there. It's the Raton Gallery. 36. Breton's purpose was to boost the credentials of surrealism and his own authority within it, simultaneously co-opting other figures he considered to have also unwittingly exemplified the surrealist spirit avant la lettre, Giorgio de Chirico and apparently Paolo Uccello, which would have come of something as a surprise to the Quattrocento master. But just as 3 years before, in 1938, Breton sanctioned his definition merely by evoking Duchamp as originator, without presenting a shred of evidence in support of what became the authoritative definition. The verbatim republication in English translation of Breton's Phare de la Mariée as Lighthouse of the Bride in the March 1994 edition of View magazine, New York, the Duchamp special, again edited by Breton, then served as the springboard for the post-World War II makeover as the recently exhumed lost ancestor of what would become known as Neo-Dada. In the same issue, the definition of the ready-made as manufactured objects promoted the dignity of objects of art through the choice of the artist was reaffirmed by Sidney and Harriet Janus in their essay titled Duchamp Anti-Artist. Their agenda are revealed in the last sentence of a typically ekphrastic hagiography, thus: but the treasure trove of subtleties in creative ideas and techniques in Duchamp's work is still essentially untouched. Tapping these resources will provide a rich yield for the new generation of painters, in whose awareness lies the future of 20th century painting. For here, deeply embedded in the meaning, is one of the great little explored veins in contemporary art. Earlier in the article, for those artists of the future, Sidney and Harriet Janus had characterised the ready-made as follows. In 1914, the year before the starting of the large glass, Duchamp had arrived at the speculative point of view as a result of which he designated objects as ready-mades. Ready-mades are what the name implies, complete objects which are at hand, and which by reason of the artist's selectivity are considered by him, as belonging to the realm of his own creative activity, conveying properties which coincide with the artist's angle of approach, endowed as a work of art by virtue of the insight and authority of the artist's selection. These objects, which Duchamp signed, most frequently machine-made, reflect the conditioning imposed by his machine aesthetic. Examples are the famous fountain, the Underwood typewriter hood, a coat rack, an arm from a hat rack, later used for a shadow. The ready-made is the forerunner of the surrealist objet trouvé, objects generally found in nature and singled out for possessing, through the workings of the elements of nature, fantasy, aesthetic configuration, and paranoid images. Duchamp's subsequent apotheosis as heroic and lowly pioneer of a non-retinal art guaranteed that Breton's misconception of Duchamp's ready-made would insinuate itself firmly in the foundations of contemporary art practice, as its tenacity, demonstrated in its survival, intact, in Lars Blunk's introduction and examples. Coincidentally, Duchamp never used the term conceptual art, coined in 1967 by Sol LeWitt, who paid no homage to Duchamp whatsoever. LeWitt himself had been preceded by Henry Flint, who had used the expression concept art to refer in 1961 to a kind of art in which the material is concepts, a kind of art in which the material is language. But Breton's construction of the ready-made that had remained unchanged after 1938 was in 1983 completely contradicted by the wholly unexpected appearance of gilt-edged testimony from the horse's mouth of 1916, revealing that Duchamp's own definition of the ready-made had neither been formulated in 1935, nor at some conveniently indeterminate moment during the 1910s, as Helen Molesworth chooses to imagine, but actually on the 15th of January 1916, precipitating out in precisely the same discursive singularity as Duchamp's configuration of the concept and his designation of the first examples. Of course, it goes without saying that since Breton's definition of Duchamp's ready-made of 1935 was not formulated until that date, then it did not exist in 1916, meaning that no objects designated as ready-mades by Duchamp at that date could possibly have subscribed to Breton's 1935 travesty, as indeed none did, for none were art, according to Duchamp. Since in 1916 Breton was a medical orderly on a neurological ward in either Nantes or Saint-Dizier, who knew nothing of Duchamp's activities in New York, this is hardly surprising. They would not meet in person until the autumn of 1919. The agent of this revelation was a letter written by Duchamp in New York to his sister Suzanne in Paris on the Ides of January 1916. First brought to the attention of Duchamp's scholarship by Francis Naumann in an article published in the journal Archives of American Art, Volume 22, 1983, titled Affectueuse en Marcel, 10 Letters from Marcel Duchamp, Suzanne Duchamp and Jean Crotty. The significance of its contents, which had remained completely unknown for some 66 years, is discussed in detail hereafter. But apart from publishing Duchamp's letter in the original French, and briefly discussing the example of the ready-made that Duchamp identified there as the first he designated as the snow shovel titled In Advance of the Broken Arm, Naumann, immensely privileged to be perhaps the only third person to read this letter in half a century, was paralysed by personal incredulity induced by cognitive dissonance, which left him with absolutely nothing objective to say about the significant content of the letter, either in text or footnotes, perhaps because that content totally contradicted the received wisdom on Duchamp's practice that held Naumann in thrall then as much as it does now. For Duchamp's letter revealed that far from being a work of art, the ready-made had absolutely nothing at all to do with art, and that as a consequence any attempt to understand it as art was utterly pointless. But Naumann couldn't believe what for him couldn't be true, and averted his eyes in the hope that it might do the decent thing and crawl away and die. An equally problematic example of Naumann's magical thinking was his gratuitous assertion in the same article, now in reference to Duchamp's letter of the 11th of April 1917, that the latter's statement that a female friend had been responsible for sending in the urinal "une de mes amies avait envoyé" constituted our first knowledge of the fact that Duchamp originally intended this work to have been submitted, Naumann's word, not Duchamp's or mine, by a woman, adding, and it is curious that at this time he does not even acknowledge that his sister, that the entry was actually his own, to his sister that the entry was his own. Once again, Naumann's initial reaction to inconvenient evidence was to force it into the mould of his expectation, like an ugly sister desperate to squeeze her foot into Cinderella's glass slipper, and we all know how that ended. Naumann first twisted Duchamp's evidence and then simply stopped talking about it, establishing the habit that persists to this day in Duchamp's scholarship of conveniently failing to address evidence that impertinently contradicts the cosy reassurances of establishment-approved orthodoxy. Of course, by no stretch of anyone's imagination except Francis Naumann's did Duchamp's confession constitute anybody's first knowledge of the fact that Duchamp originally intended anything, including that Mutt's urina should be submitted by a woman. In order to cope, Naumann adopted the fallacious strategy of ad hoc reasoning in an attempt to maintain for Duchamp a fictitious role in an event to which he demonstrably confessed he never contributed, by inventing a spurious intention on Duchamp's behalf that no evidence supports he ever harboured. And it didn't take Naumann long to then tell the female friend to take a hike as well, for there was to be no place for her in his subsequent accounting for Duchamp's urinal. The simple reason that Naumann, untroubled by any obligation to substantiate this airy fancy with evidence, found Duchamp's admission curious, was because his understanding was clouded by his unwavering conviction that Duchamp had been responsible for Mutt's gesture. But what the letter actually revealed was that the Duchamp master narrative, in which Breton's concept of the ready-made had by 1982 assumed an unassailable preeminence, had been formulated in complete ignorance of the evidence that flatly contradicted it. but at no point did this paradox cause Naumann to challenge the assumption of Breton's attribution of much urinal to Duchamp. In the substantive section of his letter of 1916, Duchamp described to his sister the genre of object that he had recently conceptualized and defined, and which he called in English, not French, a ready-made. Firstly, he instructs her to go to his Rue Saint-Hippolyte apartment, where she has already seen, in his studio, a bottle rack that he had bought as a ready-made sculpture, une sculpture toute faite. Here Duchamp uses the grammatically correct adjective for ready-made, tout fait, to predicate on the feminine substantive sculpture. As a consequence, since at the moment of its purchase the bottle rack no longer subscribed to the genre of utilitarian object or tool, but now to the genre of art, it became, as would aircraft propellers and the like, subject to disinterested aesthetic delectation in the manner of a work of art, a purpose for which it had not been designed, but to which, according to the machine aesthetic, it could now legitimately be subject. The idea that an object that was not a work of art could be subject to aesthetic delectation as if it were, did not originate with Duchamp. To paraphrase Kant, when you're dying for a piss, a urinal is the most beautiful object in the world. Duchamp makes no suggestion that anyone other than himself could perform this transmutation. Duchamp then instructed Suzanne to transform this bottle rack into what he now describes as a ready-made in English, informing her that, here in New York I have bought various objects in the same style, dans le même goût, and I treat them as ready-mades. Here the term ready-made, rendered in English not French, does not predicate as an adjective on a substantive, as in the case of the ready-made sculpture, but is itself an unqualified substantive, thus clearly differentiating the genre of art from the genre of the ready-made. Had there been no difference, Duchamp would not have drawn the distinction substantively, but there they are, enshrined in his typically impeccable grammar, the ready-made work of art and the ready-made, as substantively irreconciliable as chalk and cheese or ravens and writing desks. Duchamp now underlines their generic difference by reminding his sister that she knows enough English to understand the meaning of ready-made that I give these objects, and here again he uses the adjective tout fait, for both his ready-made sculpture and his substantive ready-mades were, self-evidently, objects that were already made, a status that was the single essential attribute determining their qualification for transmutation from utilitarian article into one or the other, a fact confirmed by all the known examples of ready-mades that Duchamp designated between 1916 and 1918 in New York, to which there was no exception. There was, of course, only one example of a putative ready-made work of art identified as such by Duchamp, the bottle rack. Duchamp then informed Suzanne that in order to complete the process of transforming a ready-made object into a ready-made, I sign them and I think of an inscription for them in English, two actions that played no part in transforming the same object into a ready-made sculpture, for that was the product of the choice of an artist, which, as Duchamp made clear, the ready-made was not. Never referring to this particular matter again, a ready-made was a ready-made object that Duchamp bought, signed with his name, and to which he appended an inscription in English, and that's all. The process involved no choice by an artist, no artist to make that choice, and no elevation of anything to the condition of art. Duchamp would confirm its anesthetic status in a number of statements towards the very end of his life, agreeing with Hans Richter in 1961, for example, that with the ready-made he had not sought to become an anaesthetist, but to discourage aesthetics. That's not to say that in his Golden Sunset, Duchamp didn't contradict himself at the same time, increasingly during the 1960s, but he didn't in 1916. Simultaneously, dislocated from its original utilitarian identity and function, and the possibility of being appreciated aesthetically, the bottle rack as ready-made became a three-dimensional equivalent of a working tool portrayed on a two-dimensional Masonic tracing board, whose purpose was not to function as in the craft practice for which its utilitarian archetype was designed, but as the casting of arcs in the manner of a stonemason's pair of compasses, or the measuring of angles as does a carpenter's square, but to serve as a pretext for the articulation of an esoteric discourse, much like the instruments of passion function in an Arma Christi, sufficiently familiar to you to require no further explanation here, whose purpose was equally not to sanction or encourage aesthetic delectation, but to focus devotion. To give Suzanne an idea of the kind of object he was talking about, Duchamp now described to his sister the first example of ready-made that he ever designated. A large snow shovel on which I have inscribed at the bottom, in advance of the broken arm, French translation en avance du bras cassé, which of course is a lazy bones in French, isn't it? To leave his artist sister in no doubt as to the substantive generic difference between a ready-made sculpture and a ready-made, Duchamp now reconfirmed unequivocally that unlike the former, the latter had nothing whatsoever to do with art. Don't tear your hair out, ne t'exprime pas trop. Trying to understand this in the romantic or impressionist or cubist sense, it has nothing to do with all that. Duchamp then described another ready-made and an as yet identified example called Emergency in favour of twice, possible French translation, Danger crise en faveur de deux fois. Duchamp next informed Suzanne that the purpose of this long preamble was to instruct her as to how she must transform for him the bottle rack into a ready-made at a distance, by proxy so to speak. Its status as such demonstrated in his instruction for her to sign it on his behalf, d'après Marcel Duchamp, at the bottom of the second page, which Francis Naumann believes is to be proof that no third page bearing any lost inscription ever existed, since according to Naumann, this capricious Duchampian idiosyncrasy allegedly served to encourage Suzanne to invent her own description for the bottle rack as ready-made. There goes that wacky Marcel again. Suzanne was to inscribe at the bottom and on the inside of the bottom circle, the lowest band of the bottle rack, in small letters with an oil painting brush, silver white colour, with an inscription, I will give you herewith. Apocryphally, the third page of the letter bearing that inscription disappeared. Thus, Duchamp's 1906 letter draws the clear distinction between a generic ready-made work of art and a generic ready-made. Had there been no substantive difference between the two, Duchamp would not have differentiated them grammatically as he did, but since he did, that substantive difference did exist. Thus, Duchamp's definition of the ready-made was diametrically opposed to that of a work of art, the one that entered the master narrative of avant-garde art through Breton's agency in 1935. Breton's definition was then mediated by Sidney and Harriet Janus's construction of Duchamp as the lost ancestor of the quintessential Dada gesture, through the agency of two exhibitions in 1950 and 1953 of the same so-called replica, sourced from the Marshal Pousse at the Porte de Clignancourt in Paris, which eventually found its way back to Philadelphia, where that which it allegedly replicated had originated. Proselytized by John Cage as to a neo-Dada generation not mortgaged to either Surrealism or Greenbergian modernism, it was the rediscovery of Duchamp's back catalogue of what Janus recommended in view as a toolkit for a new kind of modernism that laid the foundations for Cassou's theorizing of conceptual art in 1969. But none of this was in place in January 1916, even though holding it up to your blind eye might make it appear so. The forensic weight of Duchamp's testimony of 1916 resides in the fact that it never informed the formulation of that master narrative fabricated, perhaps in good faith, who knows, in complete ignorance of it. But good faith on the part of the advocate does not change falsehood into truth or fiction into fact. And since 1963, it has been incumbent upon the Duchamp critical community to reconcile the received wisdom it continues to advocate with the testimony that it continues to ignore, for the simple reason that the latter contradicts the former, a challenge that this industry has yet to meet, as the complete absence of this topic from last Plunk's Berlin introduction typically confirms. Thus, Breton's understanding of what he misconceived as a ready-made was stuck at stage 2, at the creation of a ready-made work of art by the choice of the artist, meaning that he was never in a position to understand the true status of the anesthetic, non-art, generic ready-made proper, unless, of course, he was complicit with Duchamp in a cynical deception, which is perfectly possible. As a consequence, the validity of subsequent art and critical practices that drew their endorsement from Breton's misconstruction of Duchamp's actual conception depended entirely on it being identical to Duchamp's own definition, which it wasn't. For Duchamp's ready-made was not an everyday object elevated to the dignity of the art object by the choice of the artist. It was its antithesis. It was not art at all, since it was not made through the application of subjectivity, or taste, or judgment, or via the agencies of the hand or eye of the artist, or by self-expression. The verb to make here meaning the instantiation of content in form, for which the ready-made constituted the inscription of the attributes of a pre-existing subject, into the attributes of a pre-existing object, hopefully hanging about on a street corner somewhere, waiting to be looked for. In short, since Duchamp's Readymade was not art, and it follows therefore could play no meaningful role in the realm of art, unless of course masquerading as a decoy, letting Duchamp off the hook of explaining what precisely he'd been up to, it could not be legitimately or usefully evoked as endorsing any form of art practice, especially Duchamp's own, since he had abandoned the production of art in 1912. This presents certain problems for the validity of avant-garde theorizations and practices after Duchamp died in 1968. For example, the identification of Breton's misunderstanding demonstrates that Joseph Cassouth's theorization of a conceptual art was fatally flawed by three fundamental misconceptions, none of which he could necessarily have been aware of in 1969, but ignorance of which after 1983 affords him no defense. That Duchamp had been the author of much urinal, that much urinal had been a ready-made, and that a ready-made was a work of art, none of which, according to Duchamp, were true. Whilst Cassouth's exemplary Duchampian artwork is Duchamp's ready-made, his analysis bears no suspicion that the latter's 1916 definition totally contradicted his understanding. The centrality of the assumption that Duchamp's ready-mades were to Cassouth's art theorization of a conceptual art was already established in our Art of Philosophy of 1969 as follows. The value of particular artists after Duchamp can be weighed according to how much they question the nature of art, which is another way of saying what they added to the conception of art, and what holds true for Duchamp's work applies as well to most of the art after him. The function of art as a question was first raised by Marcel Duchamp. In fact, it is Marcel Duchamp whom we can credit with giving art its own identity. The case is often made, particularly in reference to Duchamp, that objects of art are judged as objets d'art, such as the ready-mades, of course. But this has no bearing on the object's application to an art context, that is, its functioning in an art context. An object is only art when placed in the context of art. Understanding and consideration of it as an artwork is necessary a priori to viewing it in order to see it as a work of art. Art is a kind of proposition presented within the context of art as a comment on art. According to Cassouth, therefore, the Duchampian ready-made was art. It had to be, otherwise it could not have had any bearing on the object's application to an art context, or demonstrate that art is a kind of proposition presented with the context of art as a comment on art, etc. But unbeknownst to Cassouth, according to Duchamp, the ready-made wasn't. Crucially, Cassouth does not cite any replica of a ready-made, just the ready-made. That is, he typically conflates the replicas with the lost originals from which they obtained and upon which they simultaneously, incestuously bestowed a spurious tautological endorsement. Cassouth's hypothesis, predicated on the assumption that the question of the function of art was first raised by Marcel Duchamp, assumes on Duchamp's part an intention to articulate the premise of conceptual practice by submitting much urinal to the independents. But since Duchamp did not submit much urinal, or any of his original ready-mades to any art
exhibition. Do you have much text? Because we would have to have you wrap it up in a few minutes at least.
Yeah, it won't be long. By the same token that the privileged status of the art object is conferred only by the artist's intention it should be so, by virtue of functioning exclusively in an art context, Duchamp's ready-made can have nothing to do with art, since it was not conceived as a functioning in an art context. His words to his sister, not mine, but quite the opposite. This means that every example he designated as such could never legitimately serve as an exemplar for the aestheticization to which Cassouth would misguidedly subject it. As Duchamp clearly stated to his sister, but not to Cassouth, as he passed the orb and sceptre of the high priest of non-retinal art, there was simply no point in attempting to understand the ready-made on the assumption that it was a work of art, because it wasn't. I will then jump to the last little bit, okay, which is about 2 minutes. Can I do 2 minutes?
You can do 2 minutes.
Just 2 minutes. Okay. Postscript, 2 loose ends. Firstly, Duchamp never did learn whether Suzanne had completed in 1916 the transformation of a bottle rack into a ready-made. Just before he left the Lincoln Arcade building in 1947 at 97 Broadway to move to 2 streets up to the Atelier building, Duchamp wrote to his sister requesting confirmation of what exactly she'd done with the bottle rack the previous January. Clearly the matter was so pressing for Duchamp that he hadn't bothered to ask her in the intervening 9 months. But since her answer did not survive, there is no guarantee that the bottle rack ever became a ready-made. This presents a problem for the assumed status of the so-called first replica ready-made, exhibited at the Raton establishment. A bottle rack, for if Duchamp's bottle rack of 1960 never became a ready-made, its so-called replica of 1936 could not draw any aesthetic endorsement from it, since the original remained either a merely utilitarian artefact or a ready-made sculpture. And of course it's not a replica ready-made anyway. According to Duchamp in 1966, a replica of a ready-made can only draw its endorsement, as such, from the ready-made it purports to replicate. This Duchamp stressed in an unpublished interview with Robert Melville in 1966, pointing out that the 1964 example of the so-called replica urinal from the Sizzler collection, then on exhibition at the Tate Gallery, only obtained aesthetic validity from that which it replicated if what it purported to duplicate had been made by the same person. But what Duchamp chose not to say is that since he had not been responsible for Mutt's urinal, the so-called replicas thereof of 1950, 63 and 64, all different and none replicas of Mutt's, were therefore bereft of any aesthetic validity and therefore not art, because Mutt's urinal was not a ready-made. And the 13 members of the 1964 series, whilst being replicas only of each other solely by virtue of being cast from the same moulds, were not even bad copies of Mutt's original. And the French and Swedish examples, industrially manufactured a little before 1950 and 63, replicas merely of other examples cast from the same generic mould. I'll stop.
Thank you for that very
One last thing.